Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Kay, and I'm joined by producer Chris Judge, the class of 2005. Here at the Providence College Podcast, we bring you interesting stories from the Fryer family. Today, we're talking with Dr. Matthew Eriksen, professor and chair of the Department of Management in the Providence College School of Business. Eriksen, a certified leadership coach, is also the co-director of PC's Leadership Fellows Program. Dr. Eriksen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now that final grades are in for the fall semester, many faculty are focused on research. Could you tell us a little bit about your current scholarship and how you develop these interests?
So right now, I just did 2 revise and resubmits at the end of the semester, and those were around stuff I do in the classroom. One's around peer coaching, and the other one's about assignment, Ben Franklin virtues assignment. So it's about living out your virtues on a day-to-day basis and then learning about that through self-observation and experimentation. And then I'm working on a book chapter with Ann Cunliffe on caring and leadership. And we're bringing some aspects even of the class that you were in. If you remember, collected some data at the end about caring and leadership.
And I should explain that Dr. Eriksen taught a class that I recently took called Self-Leadership, where he took a pretty large group of students through a journey of self-reflection and investigation about their purpose for living, really, and working.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
And so can you tell us a little bit more about some of these assignments and the research?
So I think the whole drive behind everything for me is kind of trying to figure out how to be a better person, right? And that's something I didn't get out of the classes I took when I was in an MBA or undergraduate in business school. And, they were a lot about abstraction, generalizations, theories, but really not applicable to my day-to-day life. And I would say my journey as an academic in management and leadership has been about trying to figure out how to have a better life, have a better impact on others, and create things together that are more meaningful. And realizing that that's about being human in relationships with others, and that's embedded in our day-to-day lives. So the focus is really about developing exercises that help people understand their subjective experience and then their relationships with others and how they might move through those and around in them more effectively.
So how could coaching play into that? How could it sounds like helping others and helping yourself at the same time?
Yeah, so coaching, as it turns out, the first dean I was here, Sue Learman, actually supported me to go out and get coaching certification. And that's impacted my teaching and how I think about it, and to ultimately, most recently, bringing that into the classroom. More and more managers are being asked to coach their employees. Google did some research and found out the thing that distinguished high-performing managers was that they coached their employees. So I thought that was something important to bring into the classroom, and for many reasons. But there's clearly the developmental of others, as well as through that experience, understanding oneself, really about helping someone deepen their learning from their experience and forward their action, doing that through curious questions and deep listening, which I think are pretty basic but profound things to do. And to listen deeply takes self-awareness, self-knowledge. To ask curious questions takes focus on others. So those 2 things, I think, as you were saying, are inherently intertwined, growth of others, helping others grow, and oneself growing.
And I remember you telling us a little bit in the class that this isn't something that's really built into a college curriculum these days, or even part of student expectations anymore.
Yeah, I think the class is unique in that it's focused on each individual student and their experience, and I would say their becoming, and putting them at the center of the class as opposed to the course content or material, and really helping them understand themselves and others, for the sake of their development. Most classes are content-based, right? And they're focused on that, on tests and teaching certain things, where my class is really about a person understanding themselves and their experience, paying attention to it and trying to learn from it and realizing that's the ultimate place one has to learn, and one's ultimate concern is their day-to-day actions, right? Even the mundanity of those things. Leadership is not really about heroic acts. It's more about the day-to-day mundanity and relationships and figuring things out. So an article I wrote with Ann Cunliffe on relational leadership, we interviewed the federal security directors after 9/11. So I worked for TSA after 9/11. That was the organization that replaced FAA, and I worked in their leadership institute, headed up for a little bit. And we did some research on the federal security directors who basically went out to airports in the United States with a cell phone, a briefcase, no office, anything, and had to set up an organization from scratch and develop relationships. And in that, we realized the importance of the mundanity, of the conversations, of the dialogue, of the day-to-day, of working through experience, of creating stuff with others, not these heroic models of leadership we often have in our minds.
Yep. You teach at all levels at PC. You've got undergraduates in the business school, graduates in the MBA program, and adult learners in the PC's School of Continuing Education. What's your approach to teaching leadership skills to these groups? And they've got such a wide range of experience.
Yeah, I think that points to even what's important to leadership is that each situation you find yourself in is unique, and you're trying to figure your way around within that situation, and you're trying to achieve some goal or purpose. For me, it's to facilitate students' authentic becoming, to realize their potential and their passions. So each situation is different. As you enter, you have a kind of an overall framework, and then what I've come to say is that you have to meet the students where they are, and that's even a little bit about starting to interact with them and see how they respond. And then based on that response, choosing my response. So this unfolding emergence within that space. So there is no formula for that, but I think there's applying wisdom through the years that you've acquired from being in the classroom to each situation, right? So they're clearly different, right? The MBAs tend to be, if I go over this year, highly motivated, driven, right on board from the beginning. The day students maybe a little more selling of the meaning and the purpose and the value of what I'm trying to do. SEE, different ball of wax in terms of more experience and more busy lives, it seems, trying to often accomplish something they hadn't done early in their lives. So taking that into consideration, caring for the students, and seeing what's emerging and kind of tapping it along to achieve the purpose of the class. And in a lot of classes we sit down and think about why are we here? What are we trying to achieve is a big thing. And so students actually participate in that process and try and engage them and maybe even ask them, what should we be doing? How's it going? What's next? How might we achieve that?
Could you tell us more about authentic becoming and what are you hoping the students achieve?
Yeah, so rather than seeing us as having essences, I see us as becomings, right? In relational becomings, that we are always responding to something, and we're emerging with that. So we're actually defined by our responses, and our responses can be repeat themselves, or they can be unique in the moments. But we're constantly changing, and each moment is unique, right? And it's dependent upon who we're interacting with. We're different people. With different people, we emerge differently. We respond differently. So becoming is kind of, I would say, orienting yourself in the world in a certain way, right? Or authentic becoming is deciding kind of the person you want to be based on values and purpose and meaning, and then trying to live a life consistent with that. And a lot of those meanings and purposes are dependent on others, since we're inherently connected to others. Every action is a moral action because we're impacting others, who they're becoming, how they understand the world, and who they are. So that process is really helping people understand that, I guess, and thinking about if this is true, then how do we live life, right? So authenticity is not an essence to be found, but more a meaning to be found as one's life unfolds, right? And that can be dependent on others, right? Our impact on others. It's not just about being who we are, right, on some base level, which means just kind of, that to me is laziness, is just doing what you want. But authenticity is a relational concept that has to do with one's impact of others. So I think our authenticity develops and grows over our lives based on our experiences.
With your undergraduates, have they had much opportunity to do this kind of self-examination?
I don't think most students have had time, and I clearly didn't have the time or even know what it was, right? I was, competitive person, whether it be sports and rowing and school, trying to do well, and often more focused on competition than in doing well and worrying about myself than, being passionate or caring about what I'm doing. And I think we have a tendency to be pushed towards that. So I don't think most people, reflection, is not something that a lot of us engage in, or have the time or space to do that, and maybe what even that means.
It's not just business majors who get to work with you and work on their leadership skills and authentic selves. Can you tell us about the Leadership Fellows Program through the Centers for Orientation, Transition, and Leadership?
Yeah. So that's a co-curricular organization that Christine Goodwin and I started together. She actually invited me to go to a conference with our leadership conference, and I didn't know there was going to be an ask at the end, and she asked me to develop this program. So I think it's about 6 years old now, and it focuses on helping students understand their purpose, passion, their self-understanding, and ends with them writing what we call purpose-driven narrative. So students are drawn from all over the campus. It's a 1.5-year program now. It took, I would say, 4 years to figure out actually how to structure that. And in that program, there are also what we call companions, which are either administrators or faculty that participate with the students in their small groups. So that's a unique opportunity to have a different type of relationship with an administrator or a faculty member over a year when they participate in the small groups together.
And what have been sort of the outcomes? I'm curious, where the students are coming from. They're coming from student groups or organizations like that?
Yeah, I think Patty and Leslie, Patty Goff and Leslie Heller are most influential in recruiting those students, sending stuff out. So every once in a while you get certain professors that might send that, or certain administrators. And now more and more, I think it's from students that are in the program or recommending other students to come to that program. So there seems to be a diversity of students involved that are looking, to understand themselves a little better, kind of figuring out what they want in life and, what their purpose might be.
And this year, some of the fellows got to travel to Washington as part of the PCDC program. What was that like?
So this is the first year we set that up. So they went down and got to meet with alumni in the DC area to understand a little bit about their leadership, but also what they were doing with their lives and how they were pursuing their purpose and passion. I think it was a pretty successful trip in terms of students bonding with others and learning about different leaders and possibilities. A wide realm of PC grads down there was pretty cool, and the success of PC grads was pretty cool. So I think it opens up the students' ideas of what is possible for them upon graduation, and may not just the traditional boxes that they think they might fit themselves into, but really trying to get them to understand, like, what are they passionate about? And if they're passionate about something, that they're probably going to perform better at that rather than doing what society might expect, their parents might expect, their friends might expect, is really finding out what they're passionate about and taking a chance at doing that, and probably they're going to be more successful at that.
So in the fall, you wrapped up your 8th ValuesBased Leadership Conference with student leaders from all over the area. And it sounds like you're building some of the same skills that you work on in your classes in the Leadership Fellowship Program in this one-day conference. How do you pack all of that into one day, all of those skills and that self-reflection? Yeah,
so the conference, we try to get a speaker to really talk about themselves and their experiences, right? Not to tell students how to lead, but more being able to see maybe themselves in the stories that they're telling about their experience. And from that keynote, we roll into some experiential exercise that all conference participants do at their tables. And we get them to interact and debrief and share as a whole. So it's a nice way to connect everyone in the conference together as a group. And then they kind of go into lunch. And then in the afternoon, we have 2 sessions of workshops where the students will go in and learn about a topic and also work it into their lives and come away hopefully developed as leaders over that time. So realize with students, especially on a weekend, a little bit later start and kind of a tight time frame with those 2 workshops. But we've had great feedback from participants over the years that have attended the conference.
How many people were able to attend?
I think this year we're about 95.
That's great. Yeah. So a good group of people and just like really digging in.
Yeah, I think more than anything every year, the people that do the workshops that volunteer their time as well as the speakers are always excited, regardless of the number of students, that how passionate they are about being there and engaged with them.
So we're recording this conversation in December, and it's a time when many people are kind of reviewing the year that just passed and contemplating what the next year is going to bring to them. I'm curious what advice, based on some of the assignments that some of the research you're doing with your Ben Franklin assignment, and what advice you'd give our listeners on how you can help them on their journeys to become their best selves.
So I think the biggest thing in self-development is self-compassion, right? Believing in your inherent worth. In Christianity, I think it's called God's unconditional love. Just believing that you're of value, right? So that you're willing to kind of look and see yourself and understand your humanity and not judge yourself based on what you're trying to improve. And with a lot of those things, they say start small, right? Small is better than big and failing. And then, even thinking of your practice as experiments, and each day trying to learn about yourself when you try to practice, right? And thinking of it as a learning journey as well as trying to accomplish something. And in moments of failure, seeing those moments of, always ask yourself, well, what did I learn? What could I do different to move forward, rather than giving up, right? Seeing it as a process of, even developing oneself, not accomplishing a thing or that it says something about yourself, but more of a journey that you keep learning through your practice of it, right? And then becoming more and more committed to it. But the biggest thing is to take some action, and just start small, and then I think of it as a learning journey.
Why self-compassion? Do you think that the greatest gains from that to be had, or do you think that's the most biggest universal problem people have for themselves?
Yeah. So often with my classes, and whether I talk about self-leadership, I start to talk about, well, what does it mean to be human? And to be human means to be built to survive, right? And that survival has become maybe more about our social self than our physical self, which means we're protecting ourselves all the time. And I think we're always trying to prove our worth. And I think that might be even more so for people now with social media, thumbs up, thumbs down, the constant sense of being judged of one's self-worth and trying to prove oneself. And self-compassion is really, it's like there is nothing to prove. You're worthy just because you are. And that just allows someone to look at oneself, to have moments of failure, and to keep moving forward, and to realize that that's just part of being human. But if you're sitting there trying to protect yourself all the time, you're not going to take risks. You're not going to look at yourself. You kind of be frozen and in maybe an avoidance, and then just if you do fail in what you're trying, just beating yourself up and then giving up. It leads to a cycle that often people get stuck and can't get out of. So then they don't even want to try anymore.
Now, you had mentioned that you were a former athlete yourself, and I know you've done a lot of work with athletes here at PC in various sports. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and your own background as an athlete?
So I was, in the end, a competitive rower. Was able to win some national medals my last year, which I was proud of. And probably didn't have the most talent, but worked very, very hard. So learned a lot about, through the sport of hard work and discipline and trying to pursue something you're passionate about with that kind of drive. But athletes fascinate me because they tend to be high achievers, right? And I think I fall into that. But I love working with people that are trying to accomplish something, trying to maximize their potential and helping them figure that out. So I've done work with a couple teams here, women's basketball, women's hockey. And some of that is at the individual level, but some of that's also at the team level of helping them connect with one another, understand their interconnectedness through storytelling, and other building activities, right, of realizing that a team doesn't exist outside of its conversations, dialogue of relating with one another. So helping teams may focus on things that they wouldn't focus on otherwise. And I think if I look at my journey, a lot of the stuff we're taught about teams, leadership, really isn't meaningful to the day-to-day life of being a team member, being a leader. So it's trying to pull in concepts, ideas that are relevant to our day-to-day lives. And once again, going back to that mundanity of the day-to-day life and accomplishing something, participating in something that's emerging, unfolding, right? So even if you're a teacher or coach, you're part of that system, not separate of it, that's unfolding, and you have to think about yourself in those ways. So with all those ways, it's trying to introduce people, to ideas that might help them. The athlete, right, what might be holding them back inside their head? What kind of conversations are they having themselves? What different conversations might they have? How might they change those relationships? So, I would say, right, by raising consciousness, you're creating possibility for freedom for different choices that might lead to different outcomes. So on a very pragmatic level, I always think about what's the outcome that you want, or what outcomes are you having in your life? And then if you back into that, you look at behaviors, right? And to change outcomes, you have to change behaviors. But if the realm of behaviors you have in your current ways of thinking isn't great enough to change the outcome, then you have to go back even deeper and change who you are, how you think about things, right? To open up even other behaviors that might lead to these outcomes. So you can think about life in the very pragmatic terms, in terms of outcomes, right, that come from your behaviors and your actions that are based on the way you think and feel in the world. And sometimes you have to go back to those ways you think and feel in the world, which are much harder to change than change behaviors.
Dr. Eriksen, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. This has been a fascinating conversation. Subscribe to the Providence College podcast in all the usual places, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and our newest platform, Spotify. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Thanks for listening, and go Friars.